Hey folks, this is Tennessee State Senator Bo Watson. Do you ever feel like state politics are hard to follow? Do you wish you could hear directly from the people making the decisions? Do you really know what your elected officials are doing, the policies they're pushing, and how those choices impact your community and your daily life? Tennessee Today is a podcast where I share an inside look at state government, what's happening, why it matters, how it affects you in your daily life. No political spin here, no confusing jargon, just real discussions about the issues shaping our state. Welcome back to Tennessee Today. Today I actually have a really special guest who is from the arch enemies of political people, and that is the print media. So today I'm joined by Sarah Dolgin from the Times Free Press. Now, when I was growing up, there were two papers. There was the Times that came in the morning, and then there was the News Free Press in the afternoon. The Times was the liberal version of the local paper, and the Free Press was the more conservative version of the paper. So my dad would kind of glance through the Times, but he would really read the Free Press very, very closely. Sarah is the political reporter for the Free Press. Notice that as a conservative, I just went straight to the Free Press and just left the Times out of it, but that's neither here nor there. She joined the newspaper as a digital producer and journalist in June of 2023. So you've almost been here 2 years, right? She holds a dual degree, which is really cool, in newspaper and online journalism, which we'll talk about because online journalism is, I guess, a new concentration of journalism. And I find this one really interesting, information management and technology from Syracuse, which is in upstate New York. So welcome to Tennessee Today. Glad to have you on here and hope we have a really fun conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so what brought you here?
To Chattanooga?
Yeah. Well, yeah, Tennessee, Chattanooga, yeah.
I blindly moved to Chattanooga after college. I just wanted to work at a newspaper somewhere totally different from where I grew up in New York. And I saw an opening and sight unseen just kind of crash landed at the Times Free Press. And I've loved it over the last 2 years.
So did you did you see an ad or did you throw a dart at a dartboard and say, I want to move to Tennessee? Or did you do like most people and said, you know what, Tennessee, that legislature is really putting Tennessee as like one of the best places in the world to live. I think I want to go live there. Is that how you got there? Or how did you choose Tennessee and specifically Chattanooga?
I'm sorry to say I did not get a personalized invitation from the legislature to move here, but I did see a job posting for an opening on our digital team at the Times Free Press, so that is what kind of piqued my interest.
Were you doing some journalism? Were you doing some writing in Syracuse or in upstate New York?
Yeah, while I was in school, I was working for a nonprofit newsroom and always had kind of newspaper internships and things like that.
Did you cover the New York legislature?
No, I actually didn't. I got a little bit of city council experience, but most of my stuff was more student-focused at that time.
Yeah, because, the New York legislature, unlike the Tennessee legislature, the New York legislature is a full-time gig. I mean, they, big salary, nice cars. I think some of them have regular security and all that kind of stuff. The taxpayers of Tennessee, we're part-time, and they don't want to pay us a lot. I mean, I think it's about $24,000 a year is the salary for being a state despite what y'all might write in the paper about it. We actually aren't making millions of dollars the way people might think we are. So anyway, covered city council, that kind of stuff. Did you get hired in at the Free Press to do political reporting?
Nope. I started off on our web team where you run social media and help kind of with the back end. So that was pulling more from my tech experience, but I always wanted to be a reporter. So I kind of finagled my way in and would write any stories that were available, wrote for our magazines until there was an opening that I felt like was the right one.
Okay. So why political reporting? Why versus, something else?
I kind of fell into it, honestly. I really love data journalism, and I was kind of bored one day and just going through the Federal Election Commission database and realizing how much information is out there, kind of looking at financial disclosures and things like that, and got into helping supplement our data coverage during the election season in 2024, and ended up really liking it, meeting a lot of different candidates around town. Just felt like a natural kind of transition.
Yeah, so, we get really nervous around the media people because as an elected official, oftentimes what you say, whatever you say is, particularly when it's written down in print, is like a fact, even though you may not want to, you may be speaking an analogy, the way it's written becomes a fact. And so I think political people are really careful about what they say to the media because of the way it can sometimes get reported. How do you deal with that? Like when you're interviewing someone like me, how do you understand that I'm trying to tell you the facts, or I'm trying to tell you the story so that you can write about it? How do you understand that I might be talking in analogies or using examples and not necessarily specific facts?
Right. That's a good question. I think
Well, of course it's a good question because I ask it. It's my podcast, and every question should be a good question on here, right?
We'll see. So I would say it depends on, who I'm interviewing. Some people like to speak in analogies. Some people just kind of straight shoot. Some people will only give us statements. It really depends. And I would say for the latter, if someone's giving us a statement, that's sometimes when it's hard because that's all we have. We don't get to say, well, what do you mean by this? Or, can you give me a little bit more context? At least for me, if someone's using an analogy that I'm not exactly sure what they mean, or they say something and I've heard something different or read something different, that might be a discrepancy. I like to just tell them because a lot of times, personally, I don't always exactly word things how I would like to in an interview or if someone's asking me questions. So I like to give people the opportunity to clarify what they meant.
Do you feel like when a political person gives you an interview and then let's say an hour later, they call you and say, hey, can I rephrase that? Because that's not exactly what I meant. Or after I've thought about what I said, that's not exactly what I meant. Do you consider that to be a fair correction, or how do you manage that or think through that?
I feel like it's a little bit case by case. I think if it's something that was pretty clear they meant it, but maybe are worried about how it's going to look, that's not always something ethically that I can just change for them. But I think if someone was stumbling over their words or they thought about it more and they're talking to me and they have certain concerns that could impact their job or could impact certain things, it's different, obviously, as well if someone's not an elected official versus just kind of a person on the street who doesn't have a lot of media experience. We weigh all of those things and decide. But for the most part, if someone wants to kind of clarify what they meant or give more context, I'm always a fan of that.
Yeah, but some of your colleagues in your profession come up to people like me and they just walking down the hallway with a cell phone or a camera and then ask you a series of questions expecting you to be able to respond for that, particularly in the video journalism world where the image that they're trying to capture is as meaningful as anything you might say or not say, because many of us just feel like I'm better off not saying anything at all because I have had no time to think through or prepare for that. And that's why I was curious how you manage if a person you're interviewing says, well, wait a minute, that's not exactly what I meant to say. Will you allow me to rephrase it? So you just calculate, you weigh that to determine whether or not it's a valid excuse or not, right?
Absolutely. I try to give people grace where I can. And thankfully with print, a lot of times I'm not working with an immediate deadline unless it's breaking news. So if it's something a little more nuanced or if it's something that's a very heavily debated topic or something that's going to, upset people or is something that people are passionate about, I try to give people the chance to call me back and weigh what their concerns are before.
Well, I wish your editors were so kind, because when y'all make a mistake and we point it out, y'all make the retraction, but it's somewhere hidden so deep in the paper that nobody ever sees it. We apologize. We got this wrong about Senator Watson, but, pay no attention to this over in the corner here. So one of the things that I think political people struggle with when we're talking, particularly with the print media, is that your headline often doesn't necessarily match the content that's down below it? How do headlines come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So
I don't
reporters
ask bad questions. This is my podcast. They're all good questions.
I mean, not to say that again. I would say reporters take the first stab at their headlines. We're trying to get the gist of what the story is. A lot of times, especially with my stories, since they're political, I struggle a lot with headline writing because it's really hard to fit the gist in the headline. And then, it'll go through a series of editors. It'll go through a lot of different people who are trying to condense it the best they can. But it can be hard sometimes because there's a lot of nuance in all coverage, but especially political coverage. So we try to take maybe a part of a quote that someone said that hopefully sums it up, or we try to explain it. But also we have to, do things that will be searched on Google. We try to think of how other people are looking for it. It's a really hard process. So sometimes people are unhappy with the headlines, and we always try to hear them out and figure out what went wrong, if they don't like them.
Yeah, no, you don't. But anyway, we'll go. I mean, that's, I think for a lot of, because the headline is almost like Twitter, right? I mean, you have a limited number of characters and you're trying to capture the reader's attention. And of course, as has always been said about the print media, if it bleeds, it reads. And so the more controversial or the more attention that the headline can draw, the more likelihood that you're going to get a reader to read it, right? I mean, that's just how the process works. And whether those of us in the political world like it or not, we have to accept that that's how the print media typically operates. So within the world, since you're a data analytics person, within the print media world, what percentage of people actually read an entire article?
I don't know the exact percentage, but I mean, the attention span of people for a really long article is not, very high. It depends on, we have all these different ways of calculating it, but we try to keep stories as short as they can be unless it needs to be something that's explained a lot, or think about where in the story we're putting certain information, because after, I want to say like 30 seconds, maybe a minute, people seem to move on.
Right. So is it fair to say, again, as a political person watching how I get the importance that the media plays in keeping government accountable. Got no issue with that. And I understand that the media over time takes a cynical look at how the political process works and begins to take a cynical look at individual legislators just because they just do. I would say that I would quote Lamar Alexander here when he talks about, Lamar Alexander says, be skeptical but not cynical. I think oftentimes print media people or all media people begin skeptical, but then over time, and I hope it doesn't happen to you, but over time become more cynical about the whole process. Anyway, all that to say, if we agree that most people only read the first couple of paragraphs of a news article, then the framing of the story has to be in those first couple of paragraphs, right?
Absolutely. We have something called a nut graph, which is like the thesis, I guess, the point of the story. We try to get that as close to the top as we can. But I feel like, you want to be careful with all media people because we're not a monolith. There's print, there's video, TV reporters have a very different, they're running around having to get things on camera right now. So we try to take, all I can speak to is really our newspaper, and we try to be, as balanced and fair as possible.
That's fair. So the reason I'm asking you this is because reporters will remain nameless since I've talked to a lot of them, but I have often learned in my own personal experience, just as you were speaking of your personal experience, my own personal experience, that many times if I'm asked to give a quote on a story, my quote will be in the last 2 or 3 paragraphs of the story. And I realize that most people are never going to hear or see or read my comment. Only a small percentage of people will. It's rarely in the first couple of paragraphs. And I think that's some of the frustration that a political person, political leaders have, is that some of the issues that we deal with are really complex. And to be able to answer a question honestly and completely would require far more words and paragraphs and a longer article than the public's going to read. So we either don't answer or we try to come up with some Twitter length answer to a question, which may get then reported inaccurately because we haven't really been able to give it the context or content to that. Do you think that's a fair, by the political side of the equation in this, that's a fair analysis of how it works?
I mean, I can see what you're saying. I would say we don't have a rule to like bury, a politician in a story. I think it kind of depends on, you have to think about what the story is. A lot of times an issue gets covered, and especially if it's a long legislative issue or something that's going to have a lot of stories. Maybe if there's a new person that's chimed in, that person might be closer to the top, and things you've said in our archives or historically in previous articles might end up closer to the bottom due to context or something. But it kind of depends on what the purpose of that story is. Like if you're responding to something and that's the story, I assume that would be closer to the top. But
yeah. So what do you, and this is totally an opinion question. Prior to Watergate, the media, print media, and the government were more cooperative with each other. The print media would respect that there's certain information that probably is not in the public's best interest to divulge. For example, we could talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the fact that he really couldn't walk without significant support. And so they never showed a picture of him in a compromised position. Or the media knew all of the things around JFK and some of his behavior, and they never reported on it. But then with Watergate, and I'm sure y'all probably talked about this in your journalism class, or I expect you would, that Watergate kind of changed that equation for everybody, right? And now the media print media appears to be more interested in investigative kind of journalism than in reporting kind of journalism. Do you think that viewpoint that I've offered there is actually, do you agree with that or disagree with that?
I mean, I can't speak to pre-Watergate times because that was before my time, obviously.
Well, I know that was a direct poke at me being an elderly person over here, but that's okay. It's all right. I can take it. I take a lot from y'all anyway. I can take that. That's pretty easy punch.
I've been pretty nice. What I will say is that times have changed in terms of technology and what is available. So all I can say is, I don't really give my opinion on much as a reporter, have to be objective, but I will say that reporting and investigating to me are one and the same. Like, good reporting isn't done without looking into things. Even if you have a great relationship with the lawmaker, or if you're pretty sure what they're saying checks out, it's still our job to look into it. And there's so many new ways now to request records and to analyze data and to look at things that I think I think journalists have always been investigative, but now there's more ways to do it and ways to do it quicker. So maybe things come out now that they weren't able to do earlier.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a really challenging question. When you go into an interview with someone like me, do you go in trying to find something out, investigate, or do you go in trying to tell a story? Or is there any different? I guess I'm probably not articulating the question very well because I'm not a trained journalist. But oftentimes we feel like when we're interviewed, either in an informal, but particularly in a formal setting, that the person that's interviewing us has already structured the story in their mind. And now they're just trying to investigate us or ask us questions and fit the narrative that they have already decided upon. And if we don't give them the answer that fits their narrative, then that gets excluded from the article, or it gets way down in the last paragraph of the article where we know that 95% of the people are never going to read it. Or do you really go into an interview and it's a blank slate and here's the topic I want to talk to you about and I have no preconceived notions about it. I just want to report the news.
I would say, at least in my training and the way that our editors operate, we always get news tips. We're checking out things. Even a lawmaker might say, "Can you look into this? I heard this." And in my experience, it's always been best to be like, I'm hearing this. Can you comment on that? Or what do you think about that? I think it's not good to go in with a leading question if that's kind of what you're asking about. Like, I don't want a specific answer because as reporters, we're supposed to be unbiased and not want a specific answer, even if it's the juicier thing that's going to sell a paper, at least in my experience. I want to go in and see what you actually think or what you know about something, because sometimes we're handed a story tip anonymously in an email and it's our due diligence to check it out, but I might ask someone about it and they might be like, that's not really a story. I've never heard that, or it doesn't check out. And then it's our responsibility to make that call, because we don't just run with whatever just because it would make a better newspaper story or something.
So would you say that as a political person and a news person, that we can be friendly with each other, maybe friends, but that would be hard because there is a line that we both need to keep between and just for integrity purposes, but that we can also kind of go into any kind of conversation with each other with a little bit of distrust for each other, that maybe you're going to slant the story a way that you want it and that I'm going to slant the story the way that I want to. Is that fair, you think? Because we're getting ready to do an interview here, and I want to know how you're going to take it with me.
I guess I wouldn't say distrust. I mean, I've interviewed you a bunch of times. I would say it's a long game for a lot of reporters like myself. At least that's my approach. We build trust over time. Maybe the first time there's an interview, you're not as, open because you don't know what I'm going to write. But I think over a long period of time, and historically how journalism should be and has always been, is that there's this understanding that, there's always going to be lawmakers, there's always going to be journalists, and that we're going to need to communicate with each other. And I don't see any reason why it needs to be hostile or why there needs to be an expectation that it's going to be taken out of context. And I guess that's why an open communication needs to be had, because, sometimes if people are upset about a story, they should be allowed to tell us and we should be open-minded to it. So I think as long as that's,
But we would say when we're right on our correction, that should be a headline too. We were wrong, Bo was right. That's all I'm asking for. We were wrong, Bo was right. Okay, so we're going to take a minute here and do a little bit of an interview. I'm kind of nervous about it now because I'm going to hand the interviewing process over to you, and then if I don't like how this goes, we'll just edit this out of the podcast and we'll move on to another topic. No, okay. So let's pretend.
All right, cool. So looking back at now the session's wrapping up. Had a special session in January. You were the co-sponsor of some pretty hefty immigration-related legislation, and now you're the Senate sponsor of a bill that's been, talked about a lot, heavily debated. A lot's going on with Senate Bill 836, I believe. Could you talk a little bit about what it's been like to be at the center of this conversation around the state's role in immigration and what it should be?
Sure. Step back just a bit, for the past 40, 50 years, the United States has been in this struggle with how to deal with immigration and its impact upon our community, particularly illegal immigration, its impact on our communities, the cost associated with it. And states never really, forever, everybody just said, well, this is a federal issue. And states, particularly like Texas and Arizona, who've been heavily impacted by illegal immigration, actually started to try and do some stuff around it and said, we just need to be more engaged. Perhaps states have a bigger role to play. Tennessee's following up on that lead. And then in the presidential, the most recent presidential election, the top two issues were either the economy or border security / illegal immigration. And they would flip, depending on the poll and the week that you were doing the poll, they'd flip back and forth. But those were always the top two issues. And so President Trump got elected on, economic issues and on addressing border security, illegal immigration. That agenda had made its way into the state of Tennessee in our special session. And so much of what we did in the special session aligned ourselves with the direction that the federal government is moving in at this point. So that's how that kind of all was created. And creating a chief immigration officer, which is legislation that I sponsored, was part of our alignment with what the federal government is doing. relative to 836, which is the bill about funding undocumented / illegal K through 12 students. That has developed during the same period of time when we were having all this immigration discussion. I had conversations with people who talked about the financial impact that English as a second language, as well as what they perceived to be undocumented or illegal students in the school system, the financial impact that was having on the school system. And that was just pre-session sort of conversation. Then when we got ready to go into session, I get this resolution, and I admit it was later rescinded, but I get this resolution from the Rutherford County School Board, I believe, which said, hey, we need more money for English second language because it costs us $3,500 more per student than ELL student than it does other students. And I thought, okay, wait a minute. I've got people talking to me about the cost back home, the facility of more classroom size, different classroom size, the cost of that, the cost of English language learners, and now I have a school board independent of my home community that's talking to me about you need to provide us more money for this specific subset of students. That led me to go, okay, why are we in this situation? I didn't know that much about the Plyler decision. I don't serve on the education committee, so I wouldn't have known that much about it. So I started reading as to how we got to where we are. And in my mind, it goes back to the Plyler decision of 1982, which to the podcast crowd, this was a Supreme Court decision. It was a 5-4 decision, right? I mean, it wasn't like Board versus Brown of Education. Board versus Brown of Education, which ended segregation, was a 9-0 decision. There was no dispute that segregation, separate but equal, that was unconstitutional. Plyler was 5-4, and the 4 justices were all Republican justices, including newly appointed Sandra Day O'Connor. So I looked at it and I went, well, that's odd. I didn't realize it was that close of a decision. And I read the dissenting opinion on it, and I thought in their dissenting opinion, they make some really good points. The main one being that the judiciary took away the public's opportunity to debate and discuss this issue. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to bring a piece of legislation that will, knowing it's going to stimulate a lot of conversation and a lot of debate, which the state had been deprived of by this 1982 decision. So when I introduced it, I knew it would get a lot of attention. I knew people would be passionate about it. And I knew it would challenge conventional thinking about undocumented illegal students in our system because we have come to accept that that's just how it is. When in fact, it was a very narrow decision. If you read the dissent, they believe the majority opinion twisted, just as in Roe v. Wade, they twisted a little bit of our understanding of the Constitution to reach the conclusion that they wanted to reach. And so I thought the public ought to have this conversation. The way we have public conversations in this country is by having legislation before the elected representatives of the people. And then people, as news media reports on it, people talk about it at work, they talk about it in their communities, they talk about it at school boards meetings, and they come to a decision about it. That's how the process is supposed to work. It is not supposed to be handled by a 9-person Supreme Court that tells us what our public policy ought to be. So that's the whole germination of the bill.
Got it. And I know you spend a lot of time,
And you can never write all that in a newspaper article, right? I mean, because 95% of the people are going to get through the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, or they're going to read the headline that says, Bo Watson's for kicking undocumented kids out of our school system, when in fact, there's a lot more thought behind it. But the print media, you got to get people to the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. They're not going to get to the whole context of why this is something that we should be at least thinking and be willing to talk about, right? I mean, one of the things that we're challenged in this country with is because of the division that exists, we're unwilling to talk about difficult subjects. And I decided I'm going to talk about a really difficult subject and let the public debate it and come to a conclusion if we can. Got
it. And I know you obviously have a lot of time spent dealing with your committee as finance chair in the Senate, and you have said before that the main responsibility of the legislature is to pass the budget.
That's right.
You say that a lot of the time. So, did you see yourself when you first started off in the legislature? Would you have foreseen that you would have been kind of at the front of all of this immigration legislation, or how did that kind of become something that you became interested in?
Yeah, well, there are the two top budget items in the state of Tennessee, and they go back and forth depending on the year, are either health care, which is our TennCare program, or education, K-12 education and higher education. And so they're both financial issues, and they both have potential impact on both the state as well as local communities. Since the Plyler decision, states really haven't had an opportunity to talk about what is the actual cost of educating students who are here legally or illegally or undocumented. What is the cost of that? Because nobody collects that information. Nobody knows. I do think school systems have a pretty good idea about it, but we don't talk about it. When the Rutherford County School Board said, we need more money for each of these English language learners, it made me think, you know what? This is having an impact on the state's funding of K-12 education, and we ought to be willing and able to try and think through what that cost is. And the only way we can do that is to bring legislation that allows school systems to have that kind of debate and discussion.
And how has it felt to see, a lot of different things either coming out in support or opposition to your bill, whether it was the recent school board resolution in Hamilton County or, the local GOP coming out and supporting your legislation? How does it feel to be kind of on the receiving end of that, and how do you perceive that kind of feedback and incorporate it into your job? Yeah,
well, it's of course, if you're gonna be in the public space, you have to be willing to take criticism. I think even Teddy Roosevelt said, if you're in this space, you're in the arena. It's easy to be outside the arena and criticize the person that's inside the arena. But if you're in the arena, you have to accept the fact that you're going to get criticism, and you're going to get some praise that as well. I haven't been surprised. Perhaps the level of vitriol has been a little bit more than I expected. But I haven't been surprised that it is a passionate issue, because it should be. Education of any of our children or any child should be a passionate discussion. But I haven't been overly surprised by it. I haven't been surprised that, that the parties kind of align themselves in two different positions. Obviously, the Trump administration has taken a very conservative view of illegal immigration, and this kind of plays into that. Whereas the Biden administration had a very liberal view of illegal immigration, and so Democrats and Republicans kind of break on different lines around that. So the political aspect of it hasn't been a surprise to me at all. I do think that, again, I have even taken into the school board decision only highlights what I have been saying about the issue. It's remember that what people have not reported on perhaps as much about this piece of legislation is it is entirely permissive. The state of Tennessee doesn't tell a local government they have to do anything. It says if you choose to do something, here's the path to do it. I find it quite ironic that while they're debating the undocumented students versus illegal students and their education, they are also being challenged with an $18 million deficit in their budget, which means they're going to have to go to the taxpayers or to the county commission and get them, if they're going to get that $18 million, that $18 million only comes from one place, and that's from the taxpayers of Tennessee. And it would seem fair to me that you would be able to say, well, how much is it costing us to do this in our budget, which might be, how much is it costing us to educate every student, legal, illegal? What's the cost of the illegal students? What's the cost of the legal students? So that the public can decide, well, we're going to give you more money for that. But the debate that they have is exactly what I've been saying this bill was intended to create, was to allow local communities to determine for themselves, can we afford to do this? Can we not afford to do this? So I took no offense at it. I was actually kind of satisfied to see our local school board wrestling with a difficult issue.
Got it. And,
But you can't do that in a news article. I mean, it's hard to do that in the print media, right? I mean, it's because, again, people are video-oriented versus reading.
I mean, I don't want to undersell our readers. A lot of times people do get to the end of a story. I just would say we do keep in mind that if there are two different perspectives, one shouldn't be, buried all the way at the end, because then it might not seem balanced. But I will say we do have a lot of people engaged. The people who want context on things, especially political readers, do tend to read with nuance.
That's fair. That's fair. I think that's fair. But some of these issues are multi-column issues. When you really ask a political person, an elected official, why did you vote a certain way? To be able to answer that in a Twitter-type response can be really difficult because there's so many nuances to legislation. I mean, even like, the hemp legislation that everybody's talking about today, the nuance of THCP and THCA and how that was a loophole in the law that we passed in 2018, the nuance of all that, it's hard to communicate that to the media in a time, particularly like the video media, who's going to give you a 5 or 10 minute interview, and then they're going to take 10 seconds, 20 seconds, or just to stimulate viewer interest. And the totality of this story is so much greater.
And that's why I would say that's the great thing about print media, and now that we have online as well as an extension of print media, because we do, we don't have to condense it to 10 seconds. And I would say we don't. We do, thoroughly have time to put everything in. And I would say that if you ever feel this way, or if other lawmakers feel this way, a lot of times we're working with what we have. So if we need more context, please tell us and call us. I would say there's a lot of opportunity for follow-up always. And at least at the Times Free Press, we're always willing to take that kind of feedback.
Well, Sarah, this has been great. I will say the other thing that print media does that I think is really important is it creates a better historical record, right? And so when I was doing my Plyler research for this piece of legislation, I went back and read articles and editorials that had been written around the time that this Supreme Court case was going through to see what, the different viewpoints were. And interestingly, they weren't much different than they are today. As a matter of fact, if you haven't read the Plyler decision, particularly the dissent, if you were to go to read it, or even the affirming decision, you would think they had just written this yesterday. So I think one of the great values that reporters like you bring is that you give us a historical record so we can look back and read what at least the media was writing about in 1982 or 1882 or 1800. And I think that's a really valuable service that y'all provide to our community.
Absolutely.
So this has been Tennessee State Senator Bo Watson here on Tennessee Today. We've been talking with Sarah Dolgin about the relationship between the elected officials and particularly the print media. And I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.